You ever feel like you're just drowning in information about education? Like there's so much noise, but getting to the clear, useful stuff, that aha moment
Hmm.
feels, well, hard.
Totally. It's everywhere.
That's exactly what we're doing here on the deep dive. We try to cut through all that, get to the heart of it, and pull out the insights that, actually mean something for you.
And today, we're diving into a really fascinating intersection, I think. It's where academic research meets the real messy world of teaching language day to day.
Very interesting. So the theory and the practice.
Exactly. We're looking at how these two things, rigorous study on one side and classroom experience on the other, are kind of converging to shape more, well, inclusive and effective ways to teach literacy.
Okay, let's unpack the sources for this deep dive then. We've got two main ones on the table. First is Ruth Newman's 2025 article. It's called Developing Metalinguistic Understanding in the Secondary English Classroom. So, something about framing questions and responsive talk.
Yeah, quite a title. It focuses on dialogic, metalinguistic talk about written text. And the second source is Jaime Hoerricks' 2024 book, Holistic Language Instruction.
Right. These come from pretty different places, don't they?
They really do. Newman's work is deep research, analyzing actual classroom conversations, looking closely at how teachers and students talk about language. Very academic.
Okay.
Hoerricks' book, though, that comes straight from the trenches, basically.
Yeah.
Years of teaching all sorts of students, neurodivergent learners, multilingual students. It's written by a practitioner.
So one's research analysis, the other's like practical wisdom born from experience.
We got it.
So our mission today then is to see where these paths meet up. How does Newman's research line up with Hoerricks' practical stuff in holistic language instruction?
And what does that convergence tell us about creating literacy approaches that are more dialogic, more like a conversation, and more inclusive for everyone?
Yeah, because it feels like this really pushes back against some old ideas about who's actually capable of, you know, getting language on that deeper level.
Absolutely. It makes us rethink who we see as capable linguists and how we support that deep understanding for all kinds of learners.
Okay, let's jump into the first big connection point. The questions teachers ask. Newman calls them framing questions. What's the idea there?
So these aren't just any questions. They're intentionally crafted prompts. Teachers use them to get students talking about language choices and affects what Newman calls that dialogic metalinguistic talk.
Metalinguistic,
Right.
thinking about language itself, right?
Exactly. And Newman breaks these framing questions down into four main types, or maybe approaches is a better word.
Okay, what are?
First, you've got effect-open questions. These ask about the impact. Like, what effect does this word have on you? Pretty open-ended.
Right, focusing on the reader's experience.
Yeah. Then there are choice-open questions.
Mm-hmm.
These get students thinking about why an author made a specific choice. Maybe what language choices here create the mood.
Okay, digging into the author's craft.
Then choice focusing narrows it down, pointing to something specific, like a word type or sentence structure. Why start the sentence with an adverb here?
More specific analysis.
And finally, choice alternative questions. These push students to imagine changes. What if the author used this word instead? How would the meaning shift?
I see. So they're all designed to make students consciously aware of language as a set of choices with effects.
That's the core idea, moving beyond just understanding what it says.
And it's really interesting how Hoerricks' book, Holistic Language Instruction, seems to echo this, even without using Newman's specific labels. You mentioned questions like, what's the story here? Or why this word and not another?
Yeah, exactly. Those practical questions from Hoerricks serve a really similar purpose. They're trying to activate that same linguistic awareness.
How so, especially for the learners Hoerricks focuses on, like GLPs or multilingual students?
Well, think about what's the story here. For a Gestalt language processor, someone who takes in language in chunks, that's a really accessible way in, right? Get the big picture first, then notice the details.
Okay, makes sense.
And why this word and not another? That's gold for multilingual learners. It opens up conversations about nuances, maybe how a similar idea is expressed differently in another language, the specific power of that English word.
So it's about making the choices visible, making language feel less like a given and more like something crafted.
Precisely. And both sources really highlight that the teacher isn't just, letting the conversation happen. They're an active partner in exploring the language.
guiding it, shaping it through these questions.
Yeah, guiding and validating. Asking these kinds of questions implicitly tells students your interpretation matters. Your way of seeing this language is valuable.
And that feels like a really powerful act of inclusion, doesn't it? Especially for students who maybe haven't felt heard in other language classrooms. You're saying their noticing counts.
It absolutely is.
Hmm.
It starts to challenge that subtle gatekeeping around who gets to be an analyst of language. These questions say everyone's invited to this analysis.
Okay, so the question kicks things off, but what happens next? That leads us to Newman's responsive talk moves, right?
Yes, so this is all about how the teacher reacts and builds on what students say, moment by moment. It's subtle stuff.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Okay, so it could be asking for elaboration, like say more about that, or what makes you say that, or asking for clarification. So are you saying, or even just a strategic pause, letting a student's comment hang in the air, showing it's being considered.
Ah, so it's not just about getting the right answer, but about exploring the thinking behind the answer.
Exactly. These moves show students their thinking is valued even if it's still developing. It turns the discussion into a real collaborative inquiry.
How does holistic language instruction connect here, especially thinking about those maybe less conventional contributions from GLPs or multilingual learners?
This is where it gets really interesting. Hoerricks points out that what might look like an off-topic comment from these learners can actually hold really important metalinguistic insight.
Oh, so?
Well, a GLP might repeat a whole phrase they heard earlier, an echolalic phrase. It might seem random, but it could be their way of processing or connecting with a linguistic pattern.
Okay.
Or a multilingual student might bring in a concept or word from their home language. It might not seem directly relevant, but it could offer a completely different, valuable lens on the text or the language being discussed. Unexpected language can be data.
So the responsive move there is not to shut it down as irrelevant, but to get curious.
Precisely. It's about tuning in to what the student is trying to do with language, what they're noticing, even if it's expressed differently, and then responding in a way that supports clarity and helps them own their insight.
Makes sense.
Hoerricks also mentions using things like SRSD, self-regulation strategy development, not just for writing structure, but relationally, like modeling how you work through confusion, how you manage ideas. That builds trust and safety.
It really sounds like these responsive moves are fundamentally relational. They're built on trust, on really seeing the student.
They absolutely are. They acknowledge that students are already thinking metalinguistically. We just need to listen carefully and respond with care.
And there's an ethical weight to that, isn't there? Especially for students whose language or way of communicating has been previously devalued.
Huge. Responsive talk says, your voice, your language, your way of thinking it belongs here. It's valuable. It's a powerful affirmation.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Let's talk about the texts themselves. Newman observes teachers using published model texts to spark these metalinguistic discussions. What role did these play?
Newman sees them acting as both a mirror and a window.
Mirror and window. Explain that.
Okay, so they're a mirror because students can see sophisticated language choices in action and reflect on how language works. They see models of what's possible. Yep. And they're a window because they open up possibilities beyond the student's own current writing or speaking style. They show different ways language can create tone, meaning, effect. It helps build a shared vocabulary for talking about language craft.
Got it. That seems fairly standard, maybe, using mentor texts. But holistic language instruction pushes this idea further, right? Expands what counts as a model.
It really does. This is a key point in Hoerricks' work. The argument is that for many learners, maybe neurodivergent students, maybe those whose cultures aren't reflected in the canon, those traditional great texts can sometimes feel alienating, like something they could never achieve.
Like an obstacle rather than an inspiration.
Exactly. So HLI argues for broadening our definition of model-worthy. Think about rhetorically rich math problems or multilingual narratives, things that show language working powerfully in different contexts.
Okay, diversifying the models.
Yes, but critically, Hoerricks includes student-authored texts in that category.
Whoa, okay. Using student writing itself as a model text.
Yes. And analyzing it with the same kind of respect and curiosity we'd apply to a published author, it completely shifts the dynamic.
How so?
Instead of just red penning errors, the focus becomes, what choices did this student make? Why? What effects did they create? How could they refine their meaning? It treats the student as an author with intentions.
So it's about understanding their linguistic choices, not just correcting mistakes. That must be huge for student confidence and agency.
It's incredibly validating. It says their language matters, their writing is worth analyzing, not just fixing.
So again, these two sources seem to work together. Newman gives us a framework for analyzing texts, and Hoerricks says, great, let's apply that framework much more broadly, especially to the student's own work.
You nailed it. Newman provides the analytical tools, and Hoerricks expands the canvas, centering the student's own linguistic power.
And that brings us back to this idea of agency, which feels like a core thread here. Hoerricks really seems to be challenging who gets to be considered a language expert or analyst.
Absolutely. Well, Newman's study is focused on, more typical secondary English classrooms. Hoerricks intentionally takes these principles of dialogic responsive teaching and applies them explicitly to contexts often seen as, well, more complex or on the margins.
Like with GLPs, AAC users, students using home languages.
Exactly. The driving question in HLI is fundamentally who gets to notice language, and the answer is unequivocal. Everyone.
It directly confronts that implicit bias that maybe only certain kinds of students, usually those who fit a neurotypical monolingual mold, can do that kind of deep thinking about language.
He really does. Hoerricks applies this lens of student agency and linguistic capability to learners who are often underestimated or relegated to purely functional language goals.
And you mentioned the upcoming work, Decolonizing Language Education. How does that connect?
Well, it builds on this by arguing that actively inviting students who've been historically marginalized by education systems into the analysis of language, how it works, how it holds power, is actually a decolonial act.
How is it decolonial?
Because traditional education often implicitly taught that only certain people, usually mirroring the dominant culture, were the legitimate analysts and authorities on language. Offering these analytical tools to everyone challenges that hierarchy.
So it's about reshaping the entire field of language education to honor different ways of thinking, different languages, different cultural backgrounds.
And inviting all students to be active participants, not just receivers of knowledge, but co-constructors of understanding about language itself.
Which leads us to this idea of convergence. Hoerricks is clear this alignment between the research and the practice isn't just a coincidence.
Right. It's presented as a convergence of values, of core commitments.
What does that signal, do you think, that these two different streams arrived at similar conclusions?
I think it signals a shared response to the shortcomings of maybe more standardized or one-size-fits-all literacy models.
Yeah.
Both Newman and Hoerricks, from their different vantage points, saw that those models often miss the incredible metalinguistic potential in many learners, and they overlook how crucial the relational aspect of teaching is.
So they share a belief in language as more than just skills, like it's tied to identity connection.
Power meaning-making. Yeah. And underlying both is this deep respect for students as thinkers, as people already making sense of their linguistic worlds.
It also really seems to champion what Hoerricks terms educator-generated theory, the idea that classroom practice is a form of knowledge creation.
Definitely. HLI is a prime example of that. Practice is theory in motion, as Hoerricks puts it. The frameworks, the questions, they weren't developed in a lab. They grew out of the lived reality of the classroom. They represent grounded ways of knowing.
And when research like Newman's comes along and validates those approaches through systematic study,
it confirms what many reflective practitioners likely already sensed or knew was working. It provides a different kind of evidence, a different language, for practices rooted in care and close observation.
So ultimately, this convergence points towards a shared ethic, doesn't it? An ethos of inquiry, of relational care, of critical engagement with language.
That's beautifully put. It's the foundation for a literacy education that feels more human, more inclusive, and frankly more effective for a wider range of learners.
So the big takeaway for you listening, it's this powerful resonance between rigorous academic research and on-the-ground teaching wisdom, both pointing towards the importance of fostering that deep metalinguistic understanding for all students.
And really driving home that this kind of awareness, this ability to think about language, isn't some luxury extra. It's a right, especially for learners who might have been told, subtly or not so subtly, that language analysis wasn't for them.
Yeah, it's a fundamental shift, isn't it? Moving away from teaching as just transmitting information towards teaching as this shared process of building meaning together. The student isn't passive, they're an active co-constructor.
Absolutely.
So maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Think about your own experiences with language, learning it, maybe teaching it. What assumptions do we carry around about who's good at language?
That's a great question.
And what might happen if we consciously shifted those assumptions? What potential could we unlock in students and colleagues, maybe even in ourselves, that we just haven't seen yet?
It really opens things up, doesn't it?
Yeah,
This whole conversation about inclusive literacy is definitely not over. There's so much more to explore.
indeed. Thanks for digging deep with us today.